Okay, I think we're going to get started. I know some people are still coming in, but we'll just go ahead and start with the introductions. I want to welcome everyone to this webinar. I'm really excited to be here with Felipe and Frank, also with Carlos, who is doing the translation for us. But before we start, I thought maybe we would just give a few minutes or a few seconds of silence uh, due to the shootings that happened last evening for the Asian community. We know that for the last month or last few months, there's been just a heightened threat to their community by beatings and shootings. And so I want to remember them before we get started because, this webinar is about justice. It's about bringing forth people that have been silenced, hearing their voice. So let's just have a few seconds of silence to hear their voices, pray for their families during this time. Amen. I want to first start off with introducing Carlos Romero. He will be doing our translation. So I'm going to let people that speak Spanish, if you want the translation, there is a globe at the bottom. I'm sorry, he has it right here. If you go to chat, you will see the instructions. Los instrucciones para I can't even say the word, translation is in chat. So if you go to chat, you will see the instructions and they'll get you to the translator. So second, I want to introduce, of course, Felipe, who has written his book, Apostles of Change. And so we'll be talking to him about his book. And then Frank Schofield Sanchez. He is a member at Pasadena Mennonite Church. And he has agreed to co-host this with me. We're going to start off with asking some questions to Felipe about his book. And then after that, we're going to have a time for any questions you might have for Felipe. And you can do that by posting your questions on chat. And then we'll look at those when we get time for questions. So I think I'm starting off with the first question, Felipe. Well, you know what, Felipe, maybe you could just start off a little bit of introducing generally what the book is about and kind of why you wrote it.
Yeah, thank you, Iris, Frank, Carlos, Mennonite Church USA, everybody who put in all the work to host this webinar. Thank you so much for this opportunity. This is a homecoming for me of sorts, right? To be back in my denominational home, my church home. And so it's a real honor for me to be here with you all this evening. This book, these stories really started as I was writing the book on Latinos in the Mennonite Church, looking at the civil rights movement and the participation of Latino and Latina religious leaders during the 1960s and 1970s. I think, some of you perhaps know, I mean, I grew up in the Mennonite Church and I grew up the son of a preacher. My parents were pastors for many years at Iglesia Menonita del Cordero in Brownsville, Texas, where I was born and raised. And so when you grow up in the church, it's almost as if, you have sort of this insider knowledge about the politics of the church, the politics of religious faith. And you're also, I think, hypersensitive to possibilities and intersections and alternatives and different ways of viewing faith and the church, especially when you grow up the youngest of seven, somewhat, trying to break the rules as much as possible, trying to push the boundaries and so forth. That's something that I was a big part of. And so I feel like in my own sort of historical work, I'm always fascinated by people that are trying to push those boundaries and that are doing so within religious contexts that historically have been colonial, have been oppressive, have marginalized people of color and women in the church in particular. And so that brought me to these stories. The book is really set in a very short time period, 1969. Iris and I were laughing earlier. I was not born in 1969. I'm a late 70s baby. But the book takes place from about 1969 to 1970, really about a year, maybe even less than a year, in a moment that was a very turbulent political moment in the United States, not entirely similar to what we have been through in the Trump era and now through COVID-19. But certainly there was a moment when, as one activist that I interviewed, Juan Gonzalez from New York City, who told me in those days, there was no sense that we were going to graduate from college and find a job and live the American dream. We were worried about the country going into civil war. That was our main concern in 1969. The cities were burning. And so it really sort of takes place within these moments of great need, a moment when federal policies and federal programs like urban renewal are pushing poor people out of neighborhoods that are looked to be economically viable. And this book tells a story of young people, really ages from about 16 to about 22, 23, who stood up and said they were not going to be pushed around, even by the federal government. The book is local. It focuses on neighborhoods. It focuses on barrios. And one of the main arguments that I make in the book is that to understand Latino politics, you really have to start in the barrio. The pushback against the sort of liberal ideas of American possibility and American politics in the middle part of the 20th century get pushed back by a group of young radicals that start to envision a new world and new possibilities that go beyond simply reform. And they do this with the church and with the most powerful religious institutions in their neighborhood, mainline Protestant and Catholic churches. I focus on these four cities for a number of reasons. Number one, this is where the cases were most prominent, where the Latino groups, Puerto Rican and Mexican American, were most active: LA, Chicago, Houston, and New York City. But these are also the four largest cities in America. These are also the cities that are some of the most diverse cities in America that have histories of multiracial and multi-ethnic coalitions. And I wanted to tell that story as well. Just like Latinos in the Mennonite Church in the 60s and 70s, they were forming coalitions with African Americans and progressive white religious leadership across the political spectrum. And so this book is about their stories. The activists that are portrayed here are some of the most well-known in terms of Latino civil rights history. On the other side, for when we talk about urban renewal or when we talk about urban politics or even the civil rights movement, there's a complete sort of, on one hand, a denial, on the other hand, just a complete ignorance about the participation of Latinos and Latinas in the civil rights movement. And so I'm trying to do a lot in this book, but I'm starting small. And I'm starting in the neighborhood and I'm starting in the barrio to try to tell a big story about people that were fighting to claim dignity.
Thank you, Felipe. Yeah, earlier we were talking because this book is set, like you said, 69, 70, and I graduated in high school in 69. So I mean, I remember it. I had this grand idea, but then when I realized the ages of Felipe and Frank and Carlos, I said, Yeah, that would look kind of bad. But my idea was, hey, let's show our pictures when in 1969. And then I realized, well, Felipe wasn't born in 69. Neither was Frank. And Carlos was only 6 years old. So, uh, that would put me way ahead of everyone else. But thank you for giving that introduction to your book. Well, Felipe, the first question I had is in your chapter entitled People Yes, Cathedrals No. I was struck that the Católicos first tried to change the Catholic Church to be the church of the people by using traditional methods. In other words, they were following the rules of the master to bring change. And so that got me thinking about, Audre Lorde's book, Worth, The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House. And also Ada Maria Asazi Diaz in her book, Murista Theology. She wrote, good theology for us, Mujerista theologians, is a theology that helps our people in their struggle for survival, not a theology that helps our people, I'm sorry, not a theology that receives the blessing of the status quo because it follows traditional patterns. So, why do you think it was important for the Católicos to reach out to the church by traditional means? I mean, what was behind their thinking and strategy to do that?
So first of all, just a little by way of introduction, for those of you that might not know, Católicos por la Raza, or Catholics for the People, Catholics for the Race, was really a motley crew of LA activists in 1968 and 1969, and really into 1970. It was a who's who of, I mean, if we know anything about the Chicano and Chicana movement, right? If we know anything about Mexican American civil rights, people often go to LA, right? The school walkouts in 1968. Certainly a lot of the organizing that Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta are doing starts in Southern California. It moves to the Central Valley and back and forth. But it's really an iconic place. And Católicos por la Raza really starts off with the greatest of intentions. The idea that we want, as Catholics, these folks that started the group, at least initially, were very devout Catholics, who started out saying, when we go march with Caesar, when we stand by Dolores, we don't see the Catholic Church. We don't see our religious leadership. And as a matter of fact, it's actually mainline Protestants, Presbyterians, for the most part, that are at the head of the line, that are there standing with Chavez early on in those days, a lot of white Presbyterians in particular. So Ricardo Cruz, who starts Católicos por la Raza in early 1969, about January, he's a law student. He meets Cesar Chavez and his life is just simply transformed. And he organizes this group. He brings some friends in from East LA College, from Cal State LA, where the budding Chicano movement was really beginning to take off. And these folks begin to take on the institution of the Catholic Church. And it revolves in LA primarily because right at the moment when the Catholic Church in 1969 is cutting programs to Catholic schools that are benefiting Mexican Americans, they are building a huge cathedral. If any of you have been to the western end of downtown in Los Angeles and you know of St. Basil's Catholic Church, it is a beautiful, intimidating structure. In 1969, just as the church is erecting this cathedral, it is cutting programs that are benefiting their largest constituent group, or at least one of their fastest growing constituent groups. So Católico organizes not just around, let's get the church to be more involved in the farm worker movement. It starts to really rally around this push against the closing of Catholic schools in downtown LA that were benefiting Mexican American students. When you go to the Catholic school system, you are now touching multiple lives in Mexican America in LA, right? And so being able to attract different folks and so forth. Ricardo Cruz was smart. he knew that just like MLK and the Southern Christian Leadership Council, if you don't want to be labeled a communist, if you don't want to be labeled anti-church, then you take on the name, right? Just like the SCLC did with putting Christian in their name, you take on Catholic and Católicos as a real, strong identity. And they did, and you're right, Iris. Initially, as I document in the chapter, they are very courteous. They're very kind. They go and they meet. They want to meet with Cardinal McIntyre. James McIntyre was one of the most conservative, cardinals in the United States, if not the world. If you wanted to preach any liberation theology, Cardinal McIntyre was going to shut you down. The Catholic Church was more progressive in San Antonio than it was in Los Angeles at that time, just to give you an idea of what was going on. So the Católicos begins this, and when they organize, they bring in the Immaculate Heart Nuns, which were a progressive group of nuns at that time. They bring in welfare rights activists, people like Alicia Escalante. They bring in Mecha, the Movimiento Estudiantil Chicano de Aztlán, the students at the college level. So Ricardo's able to pull in a bunch of people, and all these activists come together around, you mean we're going to take on the Catholic Church? Orale, let's do it. This is the most oppressive institution in our lives. This is the one institution that, our mothers forced us to go to mass every Sunday or forced us to go to church. And now that we're in this moment of raised political consciousness, we're going to push back against that. I don't think their aims, at least initially, were wrong, or that they were somehow not understanding what was going on. In the chapter, I sort of document how the refusal of Cardinal McIntyre to actually meet with them, even just a meeting, just to talk about, can you reinvest in our schools? How that in effect radicalizes Católicos and pushes them to the brink to say, we're going to take on this institution. And they end up taking on that institution in one of the most radical ways, by disrupting Christmas Eve Mass. And you'll read the book for the details of that story. It's an incredible, incredible story that I feel, if there are any playwrights out there, if you read this chapter, I feel like it should be performed and not read. It's that powerful of a story, because just as picture Christmas Eve night, it's 1969. Here you have a group of Mexican Americans. And by the way, Puerto Rican bishop that had joined them as well, different folks from the East Coast that had come over to support what they were trying to do with the Catholic Church. And on Christmas Eve, just as they are starting to march in and walk into Mass, and they are each of them shouting loudly, "Let the poor people in, let the poor people in," Cardinal McIntyre locks the doors. He had already hired undercover police officers to serve as ushers. So when Católicos breaks in and breaks through those doors, the ushers start to beat up on those kids and start to beat them up quite profoundly. The interesting thing is that just as that is happening, the choir director instructs the choir to start singing, "O Come All Ye Faithful." So what you hear as this melee is going on is, "O come all ye faithful, and let the poor people in." Contrasting visions of what the church is all about. And that radicalizes that movement. In that case, in the Catholic Church, after that night, it was a one-night sort of melee, and that's the chapters really sort of revolves around this one night. The Catholic Church prosecuted 21 of those kids. They served jail time. They were beaten by police. Ricardo Cruz he struggled for the rest of his career in Los Angeles to get a law license because of his participation with Católicos. So, they started out with this vision about reform, as you mentioned, and you can't use the master's tools. And I think they quickly learned that lesson, and they suffered a steep price. They were the only group in this book that I write that was prosecuted by the church.
That's an incredible story, Felipe, and I wanted to follow it up with something that I think your book traces really carefully and in a way that's very subtle, which is the theme of apparent defeat of a lot of these movements. Even talking about Católicos por la Raza, you focus a lot on the story of this church occupation and the disruption. But then in all the other stories, there's also that theme of, they disrupted, and then it seemed at the moment there's all these prosecutions, for example, that seems like an immediate defeat. And yet your book traces a larger thread. So my question is this, some people might say that a lot of these movements of radicals were a failure. That's actually the kind of logic I even hear nowadays, a lot of times for people dismissing movements that are radical of this sort, all across the country and the world, really. And yet by the end of the book, it's obvious that things are more complicated than just being a failure or a success. Change does come about, and sometimes even radical change. And so I guess I'm wondering if you can talk to us about this dynamic between defeat and between change, and what these young radicals can teach us about that, and maybe tell us some stories in the process.
No, that's a great question. Thank you, Frank. Where to start? I think one of the places for me is to say right off from the beginning, every major evangelical and Catholic magazine at the time deemed all of these occupations as failures and a supreme waste of time. They called them gangbangers. They called them vigilantes who were vandalizing the church. They did no such thing. They really portrayed them in a very negative light. And I think that initial portrayal from those journalists, Christianity Today in particular, has kept these stories out of our understanding of Latino religious politics during this time, because the longest occupation lasted 21 days in Houston, Texas. And most people, without doing much of the research or without even talking to these activists, got a sense that it happened, it broke down, and then everybody moved on. There's also sort of a larger sort of theoretical orientation here that's happening in terms of how, as historians and as people who study the movements, and as we've already deemed it, as people that weren't a part of those movements. I wasn't born in '69, right? I wasn't around during that time. To be very cautious, to be very careful in terms of how we portray these movements as failures, or how we portray radicals as simply irresponsible youth, as youth that maybe had no direction in life at the time, or whatever it is, that in reality, these young people were projecting a new vision of what was possible. And even as many of them saw themselves outside of the realm of the church, they grew up in the church. A lot of them, they were altar boys. Some of them taught Sunday school class when they were younger. Some of them were devout Pentecostals with futures of being Pentecostal ministers. So when they go into these sacred spaces, it's almost as if they take on that sort of understanding of what it means to be inside of a church, right? And what the Gospels tell us about the life of Jesus Christ and so forth. And it's not often that as a historian, you're in the archives and you're, you get either the emotions that go through your body, or maybe you start to get teary-eyed, or maybe you start to get, really encouraged by what you read. But that happened time after time in this story. And it happened when I would find the articles and the written notes of clergy, Latinos and Latinas as religious folks, who would reference these occupations years later and would say it was because of what the Mexican American Youth Organization did to our church in Houston that we now have a daycare center in our church, right? I think we really need to move beyond this notion that somehow civil rights activism has to lead to some sort of reform at the legal level, that somehow it only counts if they took the case to the courts, that somehow the visions and the ideas of organic intellectuals, of people that were in the barrio, of kids that some were in college, some were not, that were envisioning something new, that we have to listen to them very carefully in terms of what they were trying to pitch to us and what they were trying to reveal to the church at the time. The church certainly wasn't ready. I think I find in documents from the clergy, and by the way, that was one of the most enlightening parts of writing this book, was to find the actual words from clergy, because it's a little easier to find the words from these activists, archivists, librarians, other people have done really great work at keeping the papers of the young lords in New York City and in Chicago. There's a lot of oral histories. There's not as much on Latino and Latina evangelicals or Latino and Latina Protestants and their stories and their oral histories. And so to find those records really sort of helped me to move beyond this notion that these were meaningless charades of vandalism as they were portrayed, at the time. So that's my hope, is that we begin to see the civil rights movement very differently, and not simply through this lens of success versus defeat, but that we move beyond that to what were the questions that these activists were raising? What were the ideas? And what did they envision in terms of mutual aid for their communities? And I can say more about that, but that really came through, no doubt.
Thank you, Felipe. My question is, and since I was around in '69, and as a Latina at that time, I do remember in high school being told that my sisters and I were not good marriage material because we were too independent as Latinas. And that's kind of funny in some ways, but in other ways is when I'm reading your book and all these, young women involved in all these movements, but we, seldom we heard their names. So first of all, I want to say, I appreciate how much you mentioned Las Hermanas in your recount of the various movements within the communities. And I'm just saying that, in '69, going from high school to college, I knew all of these things. There were a lot of things going on in the Latino communities all over around the civil rights and unrest, and really not knowing our place, even questioning whether we should be in college or not. Those were questions raised a lot. And also the whole idea of women going to college as a Latina, that was a big deal. But I know that like many women like Dolores Huerta, I mean, she was a mastermind behind the movements of Chavez. I mean, a lot of people see him, but she was really the mastermind around a lot of the different things that they did. But we didn't hear much about her till years after. And even now, there's more and more things being said of the kind of work that she did behind the scenes, oftentimes. So I guess my question is, to what extent were the roles of Latinas influenced by, is it by white patriarchy, or was it by the machismo? And are they the same? Are they different? What do you say?
Well, it wasn't so much a surprise to me. I think some of the groups that had the most sort of progressive ideas or ideologies around gender and Chicana feminism or Puerto Rican feminism in New York City and in other places tended to be these more sort of radical groups. The Young Lords end up participating in reproductive rights movements. They, in their 13-point program, they're very clear that we're not talking about a revolutionary machismo. We're talking about down with machismo completely. There's no way that you can have revolutionary machismo, right? In the Chicano movement, if you were, I mean, the gender politics were so evident everywhere in terms of, if you were a Chicana that was advocating for, feminist politics, you were questioned, right? Your loyalties were questioned. You were called agringada, right? Or vendida, somebody that was a sellout because you were putting your gender above your race, right? And the idea was, let's take care of the race part, the culture part, and then, we'll move on to other issues, and we'll move on and address the concerns that women have. Women weren't having any of that, and to sort of move beyond this notion that somehow we must be sort of laser focused on either race or culture. And women were saying it's both gender and race. It's an intersectional approach that we're taking here. But they paid a steep price for those politics a lot of times. In these movements, because they were mutual aid based, you had a lot of women that were involved in welfare rights. You had a lot of women that were involved in reproductive rights. There were women that were in religious leadership throughout this process. And I write about her a lot in this book. Lydia Lopez was part of the Episcopal Church and joined Católicos por la Raza, ended up becoming one of the central leaders of the sanctuary movement in Los Angeles in the 1980s. Her life is it's an arc from the Chicano movement all the way to the sanctuary movement in the 1980s. And she was one that really sort of represented this this pushback against a type of Chicano nationalism that was strictly focused on, race and culture, and was in every way possible involved in multiple avenues of the movement. In Houston, people like Yolanda Garza Birdwell, who's still very much around, still very active, and during those times she was a Mexican immigrant to Houston. She comes into the north side and she meets these young Chicanos in this barrio, and these young Chicanos in Houston are speaking this sort of Spanglish. They can't speak English very well. They can't speak Spanish very well. And Gregory Salazar in one comment says, and here's Yolanda, this Mexicana who speaks perfect Spanish. None of us even understand what she's saying. She's, she got them together, right? She begins to go to the, she lives in if Houston, it starts off in the Montrose area, the Montrose neighborhood, because she was a part of that whole kind of new left culture in Houston at the time in the Montrose area. But she works in the north side, which was a predominantly Mexican American community, and really starts to get these young cats organized and bring them together and give them a vision. And here's the agenda, and here's what we're going to do, and here's how we need to move forward. So in every case, you have multi-ethnic, intergenerational, movements that I think sort of move beyond the sort of notion that somehow women were in the back. And not to say that that wasn't the case everywhere, but just to say that women had to fight for those positions and to take that kind of leadership role in the ways that they did within these churches. It was one of the, I think, most, enlightening things for me to meet Yolanda and to meet Lydia years later, and to talk to them about their work and their commitment on one hand to the church, and their commitment to social activism and social politics on the other, on top of their entire lives, on top of everything that they were doing. I mean, Yolanda, and I write this in the book, just to not be sexually harassed as she was walking down the street on her way to work, would dress as much to look like a man as possible so that men would leave her alone, right? And so these were sort of daily challenges that these women were facing, even as they were the leaders of some of these movements.
Thank you for those reflections, Felipe. One last question I have before we start opening it more to the rest of the audience. I see already a first question on the chat. Folks can continue putting any other thoughts or questions they have for when we finish these sets of questions. And what I wanted to talk about was this theme of space, like literal physical space, that stood out to me in the book. I think one of the reasons I realized after I submitted the question to you that I had been drawn to that was because I think I've seen how in Christianity we often focus a lot on like time and timelines. Even the way we understand salvation is this progression of a past, and then we get to know Jesus, and then Jesus changes our life. But it's oftentimes time. But these activists, these radicals, these youth were thinking about space. They were in spaces that were being affected by urban renewal, that was leading to displacement. Urban renewal, I kept reading it and I kept hearing the word gentrification in today's terms, which was leading to displacement and the harm of their communities, worsening economic conditions. And then what they decided to do was use church space, again, literal physical space, neighborhood, church, physical spaces, to stage these occupations in protest of the urban crisis, right? So in one way or another, space continues having a central role. And so I'm wondering if you could tell us about this history, how space led to these actions taking place. And especially you use the term sacred space, not just to mean, I think, not just church, there was something more to that language you were using and what it meant to these youth at that time. Um, and so, if you could tell us some stories about that and how even that might challenge us to reimagining church space, neighborhood space, the literal physical places that we're all living, probably all across the country on this call.
It wasn't difficult for me, Frank, to think about the vision that these radicals had, because I grew up in a church that was a multi-functioning kind of space, right? We had a daycare. There were always programs for the community. We had a gymnasium where kids from the barrio would come in and play basketball. I played a lot of basketball there. We were, for a moment, an area where refugees from Central America would come and stay in the late 80s, early 90s. In the gymnasium, I was in junior high at the time, met many of them, didn't understand what they were going through, but I did know that our church functioned as a worship space, as a community building space, and as a place where people could come and find, refuge. And I think when you delve deep into Latino history or Latin American history or immigration history, you're constantly dealing with the question of displacement. You're constantly dealing with the question of, economic policies that negatively affect rural farm workers, people that live in el campo, people that, are not benefiting from, the sort of small urban sectors that tend to benefit from capitalist development and so forth. And so these issues arise everywhere. And for these radicals, and this is why I say that the neighborhood, the barrio, is so important, is that for Lincoln Park residents in Chicago, for Puerto Ricans there, for Mexican Americans there, for African Americans, and for whites in that whole area there in the north side and in the south side of Chicago, the neighborhood, especially for Puerto Ricans, represents a mini Puerto Rico. If you go to Spanish Harlem in East Harlem in the years after World War II, where Puerto Rican migrants were coming into the area, the different boroughs, certainly of New York City, but many to what we know of today as East Harlem or El Barrio. And then from there, recreating their home, right? Recreating what they knew and what they recognized in the middle of temperatures that were radically different from what they were used to back home. East LA, recreation of home in those barrios. In the north side, all of these radicals were the children of immigrants. They were young people that grew up from parents who had this American dream. I get emotional just sort of thinking about it now, but they grew up in an America that displaced their parents, that continued to push them out of these areas. And the one space in terms of them envisioning something new was the church. This was the one area where if we're going to find home, if we're going to find some stability, then maybe we can find it. Maybe we can find it here. And I was always amazed. In every case, you read the 4 chapters, these young radicals start off asking for permission. People think they just stormed the church one day. They didn't. There was a whole process, 6-8 months leading up to it. Conversations with the pastor. Juan Gonzalez in New York says, the pastor of the First Spanish Methodist Church, who was Cuban, says he probably saw a bunch of Che Guevara lookalikes coming at him. And, he wasn't going to say yes to us, to using the church, But I marveled that once they occupied the church, and whatever your politics or your thoughts are around that, that's fine. But for me, once they were in there, the way they treated it as sacred space, really, if you know anything about the Nuyorican Poets Cafe in the Lower East Side in New York City, you know that idea of poetry and coffee and community and singing starts at the First Spanish Methodist Church. That's where they start to recite poetry. That's where they start to teach Puerto Rican history. That's where they start to sort of articulate a vision for the world, where they set up healthcare screenings for people. Lead poisoning was a big thing at that time, tuberculosis health screenings, where there were clothing drives and clothing giveaways. And, you know, building on the idea from the Black Panther Party, a breakfast program for kids in the neighborhood. All of these things were replicated. Houston, Chicago, New York, everywhere, where they were inside of this church building, and knowing that, you know, yes, people go to church to worship. Yes, that's a huge function of that sacred space of people's connection to God. But you can't do this without a connection to each other and without a connection to your community. And that was central, you know, for them, and trying to make sure that, you know, they treated the space with care, to make sure that they did not, use the sanctuary. They mostly used spaces outside of the sanctuary, to not go in there. And that was always, I think, something to marvel, because I wondered, for many of them, as they were in there, if they were sort of reminded of what this space was like when they were children, and what it meant to their families, what the church means to immigrant families when they first come to the United States, as a welcoming sort of space and as a welcoming community. So I don't know if that really gets at your question, but that's sort of what I was sort of thinking about throughout this whole time, is just, you know, here you have a group of radicals that have all these fantastic ideas. They just don't have any space to get together and to congregate. And we know from the African-American civil rights movement that churches were used as gathering spaces for political organizations, that, you know, you had civil rights activists that would preach, that would organize, register voters, all of that. And there's a same radical tradition in the Latino community of using church space as a space for mutual aid and mutual care. And I think you could make an argument that we need that today more than ever.
Thank you, Felipe. So we're going to have some time here for questions. If people, we're going to look at the chat here and see. Let's see, where do we go here? All right. Do you see him, Felipe?
Let me pull them up. Sure.
Yeah, I'm just trying to, I think here's one from Ellie. I think she has one here. She says, I hear you talk about the power of grassroots movement. How can we do the same today?
Well, first of all, hello, hermana. It's great to see you on here. La hermana Soto was at a place where I gave a talk on Católicos some years ago, and I was in the middle of writing that chapter. I think it's already happening, to be honest with you. You know, I just got done actually writing another piece on contemporary mutual aid and grassroots movements in churches across the country, focusing actually on these same spaces. I wanted to sort of revisit. If you go to the First Spanish Methodist Church website, or they have a Facebook page, they continue to be the People's Church, right? These activists renamed these churches that they were occupying, they renamed them the People's Church. I think the pandemic, the era of Trump, the kind of economic disintegration, the kind of economic fallout that families across this country and everywhere are dealing with, the images of kids in cages on the border, the fact that continues to happen in terms of what, the number of children that are there now, unaccompanied minors that are there now. What often doesn't make it into the news are a lot of the grassroots organizations that are already there doing tremendous work and could always use more work, certainly. But I think there's a renewal of that mutual aid tradition. And that's a long one in Latino communities, going back to the 19th century. I think for all marginalized communities, for immigrant communities, this notion of taking care of each other, of looking out for each other in the neighborhood, in the barrio, is something that's a part of who we are. It's really sort of a part of our DNA in terms of knowing and understanding that the government isn't going to be there for us. They're not going to come through, and we've got to do it for each other. So I've been quite impressed at watching a lot of these mutual aid organizations, churches in particular, that as of late have not only started to speak out, and a lot of Latino Pentecostal churches even too, that have done the immigration work, and after the murder of George Floyd, really begin to be involved much more in Black Lives Matter movements. And I think that comes out of a sense of, responsibility, and a sense that, the murder of Black men, Black people in general, just keeps happening by police. And so these churches organizing and getting on and doing this kind of work has been, quite inspiring. I don't know how it happens. It's not magical, because it's work. It's people putting in the time, putting in the sacrifice, but there are networks, and we are seeing it happen. We saw it happen here. We had to reschedule this event because the original scheduled date was in the middle of a freeze here in this state. And the way that people came through, the way that neighbors came through in terms of we were out of water at our house, bringing us jugs of water, and then the mutual aid that was stretching through social media on Twitter, right? People sort of saying, hey, somebody needs delivery out there. Can you Venmo me some cash? Because we got to buy meals for these folks or get groceries for these people. It's an amazing thing to watch. And I think oftentimes, especially Latino religious communities, for whatever reason, we get deemed as apolitical or conservative, or in the worst cases as Trump supporters, whatever it is. And I think there's a whole nother narrative that, not only me anecdotally grew up watching and living, but have seen in churches across this country.
Okay, the next question, Felipe, is from Isaac Villegas. He says, I'm loving the book, Hermano, and he has a quick question. In Joanna Fernandez's book, she points out the intentional distance. Oops, I'm not very good at the scrolling thing here.
Read it. I got it here in front of me. You want me to
Carry it on if you want.
Oh,
What?
I can carry it on if you want.
Oh, yeah, great. Okay.
So it says in Johanna Fernandez's book, she points out the intentional distance the Young Lords put between themselves and Alinsky organizing in East Harlem. I was intrigued to see that in your book, the Mayo Group were inspired by Alinsky. Can you talk about how that difference of organizational tactics worked out on the ground? This stuff is super important for my organizing world these days. The difference between IAF, Alinsky, and kinship organizing like Song.
That's a great question, Isaac. It's by no means quick at all. But Chavez and Huerta, who start with the community service organization and are deeply influenced by Saul Alinsky. Chavez is mentored by Fred Ross for 10 years. Everything that Chavez learns about organizing comes out of there. Another Chicano organization, two of them actually, COPS in San Antonio, the community I'm not remembering the name, but it was a religious organization as well. And then UNO, the United Neighborhood Organization in Los Angeles in the late 70s and late 80s, was also very tied to the Alinsky model, being very specific about the kinds of movements that you were going to take on, being very intentional about who you were going to challenge, making sure that you're looking for winnable causes. All of these things, I think, that were central to that Alinsky model. It varies. It certainly does. And I think, with a group like Mayo or, Chavez, or even other groups that would have come out of the Southwest, there is a deep connection to that Industrial Arts Foundation, which was a huge funder of some of these activist groups. And with the Young Lords, it was a completely different vision. I mean, I think it speaks to not only tactical differences in organizing, but even the ways in which they viewed themselves. I struggled with my use of brown power movements. I wanted that originally in the title, but understanding that in New York City, Puerto Ricans would have come to Black power before they would have ever come to brown power. And understanding the African diaspora and how alive it was in the Puerto Rican community, but also the connections, the kinds of geographic spaces where they lived which I think fundamentally shifted and the kind of tactical sort of organizing that they did and that they were involved in. The Young Lords in New York City were also a very heady group. They were much more sort of an intellectual kind of group. Many of them were college students who had their own ideas about change and so forth. And so it's no surprise that they would have differed in one way or another. But I think that's the difficulty, right, of writing these sort of larger movements on the Latino freedom movement, is that within each region and within each area, you're going to have different tactics and different ways of viewing things. But that's a great question. I wouldn't mind talking more with you about that at some point for sure, because it's a really interesting one. Alinsky had a huge influence, especially in the Chicano movement. There's no question.
Okay, let's see here. Ellie, okay. She asks, these radicals seem to hold on to their faith identity, but disconnect to the church as an institution. Yet these movements toward real change were still coming from their faith. Talk more about this.
I struggled with this a lot, to be able to sort of think about, their own faith practices and their own, sort of dealings with the church. It's difficult because I think they were in that sort of borderlands of, wanting to reject the church as a colonial institution, and then also seeing the liberative possibilities, of that. They did use their knowledge to their advantage when they occupied the first Spanish Methodist church in New York City. One of the young lords grew up Pentecostal. Several of them did. No surprise there, right, in East Harlem. But they were able to tell the other young lords who did not grow up Pentecostal when La Hora de Testimonio was going to happen in the church, and what the sort of structure of a Latino church service is, in terms of being able to raise some of the concerns that they were raising at the time. Felipe Luciano was a preacher. Many of them were. Many of them learned the cadence of preaching and keeping the attention of an audience for longer than 20 minutes. And they used that to their advantage in terms of the kinds of organizing they did in a city, by the way, that was already saturated in drama, New York City, right? But throughout, I kept asking that too, Hermana. I think for me, it was, what did faith mean to you? What drove you to this? And there was never really one direct answer. There was always sort of this sense that the church was a powerful institution. And there was also a sense, and I got this a lot from the folks in LA as well. Some of you might know of the Church of the Epiphany in Los Angeles, which was a central space for the Chicano movement. It actually housed the La Raza newspaper, which is a very important newspaper at the time. It also housed one of the most radical Chicano groups, the Brown Berets. Many people don't know that, and gave space to them. When I spoke to one of the Brown Berets, when I spoke to former Brown Beret, when I spoke to Carlos Montes in Los Angeles, interestingly enough, the church for them had been their entire lives a very judgmental space. And here they are as young people, young radicals, and they find this Church of the Epiphany with Father John Luce, if I'm remembering the name correctly, housing them, not judging them, giving them the kind of space that they needed to do the kind of work that they needed to do. None of them had come to Jesus moments, but they were, there was a deep respect for spirituality, and there was a deep respect, even as they rejected the institution, there was a deep respect for the clergy and the leadership, because many of them, and this is something that's often left out of the Chicano movement, is the fact that there were clergy that were often there supporting young Chicanos and Chicanas as they were doing the work that they were doing. So it's not an easy, it wasn't never sort of an easy question for me to really deal with and to really address. I tried to do it. Hopefully I came somewhat close. We'll see.
I think the next question kind of connects to a lot of things you've started speaking to already, by Sylvia Shark. How did the Católicos movement change the I assume RC is for Roman Catholic Church in the US. Was there a spillover to other churches?
30 days after the disruption on Christmas Eve Mass, Cardinal McIntyre retires. 30 days after. And, people, I mean, I spoke to some Roman Catholic scholars and they're like, well, you can't make that assumption. And, James McIntyre was already old and all that. But if you read all of the documents, if you read the LA Times, if you read anything on him leading up to 1969, I mean, there are hints at the church wanting to sort of push him out, but they're not coming from him. There's no hint on his side that he wants out or that he's getting too old or that he can't handle the responsibilities anymore. And so I took that risk. And what I mean by I took that risk is I went ahead and made it part of the argument that what Católicos did is that they forced Cardinal McIntyre to retire, and they brought in Timothy Manning, who wasn't all that great, but he was at least listening to the young people. He was at least saying the world is changing, starts to even talk about, and this is 1970, liberation theology, right? This is already, liberation theology is already in the vernacular. There's already a movement in Latin America that's going on. And Manning is finally beginning to acknowledge that McIntyre might not be the person to lead that. And McIntyre admits it himself. I'm not the person to be here in this new spirit that is taking over the church. Immediately after that, in February of 1970, the church pushes all kinds of resources to organize and to help institutionalize a group of Chicano priests called Padres. And Padres, the name stands for, it's basically a Chicano priest movement, right? But Padres had been working to take off. Virgilio Elizondo, some of you might know his theological writings, was a part of that, and many others as well. But the church begins to put its muscle behind groups like Padres. It starts to put its muscle behind groups like Chavez and the United Farm Worker Movement. Granted, Chavez had already been boycotting and striking for 5 years. And it was Católicos that I argue really sort of tips the scales in the favor of a lot of these movements. And you start to see Roman Catholic clergy showing up at brown beret events, radical young people, radical young Chicanos and Chicanas, and starts to show up to their events. The first Mexican-American bishop, Patricio Flores in the United States, takes the helm, and Mariachi Mass becomes a thing. It had already started before, but it becomes a more sort of national event. And I think Católicos was an embarrassment to the Catholic Church. They tried to hide it as much as possible. And for me, it's all about exposure, wanting to make sure that, we don't give the Catholic Church too much credit in terms of liberation theology or the United Farm Worker Movement, because just as they were pushing Padres and just as they were promoting people like, Bishop Flores and Father Elizondo and others, they were prosecuting 21 young Chicanos and Chicanas in Los Angeles for essentially, asking the church to recommit itself to their community. So I think there was a lot that came out of it. I think they tipped the scales. I think they were the ones that sort of, if you want to use Malcolm Gladwell type language, it was the tipping point. It was that sort of, it took it over the edge and made it happen in a way that it hadn't done it before. Católicos brought television cameras to the Catholic Church. Católicos brought national news. The New York Times was covering it. Everybody was looking at them. The interesting thing is that after that, Católicos por la Raza disintegrates. By September of 1970, they ceased to exist. And yet I think their legacy lived on in the kind of cultural forms that Vatican II had started to institutionalize in the mid-1960s.
You're muted, Iris.
Okay, I'm just trying to see if I see another question here. Um, how did the Catholic movement change the Reformed Church in the U.S.? Was there a spillover to other churches?
Oh, we just yeah, we just
Is that the question? Okay,
yeah.
sorry.
Frank just read that one. Yeah.
Okay, so I think that's the last question I see. Okay, sorry about that. All right. Any other questions? Or I don't know, Felipe, if you want to tell a story. I had asked Felipe, he's such a good storyteller that maybe we have time, he'd like to tell a story.
I mean, I think I was inspired in learning of these stories and reading them, and I couldn't believe that nobody had really devoted as much attention to what had happened in these churches and in these church spaces, and to also think about the role of religion in the Latino freedom movements across the United States and the ways in which churches, whether it was through funding or whether it was through marching with protesters or being in solidarity with these groups, the incredible work that they did. I think about the Reverend Bruce and Eugenia Johnson from Chicago, from Lincoln Park, who were pastors at the Armitage Avenue Methodist Church, which no longer exists. There's a Walgreens now if you drive through there. But they were brutally murdered in their home in September of 1969, only 2 or 3 months before Chairman Fred Hampton was murdered, the chairman of the Black Panther Party in Illinois, and only 3 months after Manuel Ramos was killed by police, in Chicago. And by the way, the murders of Reverend Johnson, of Reverend Bruce Johnson and Eugenia Johnson, remain unsolved. Nobody knows what happened. They were stabbed to death in the church parsonage in their home. Um, you know, Part of that legacy of these young radicals and what they were doing was forming coalitions with white clergy, forming coalitions with African American clergy, with African American kids from their barrios, from their neighborhoods. They were at a very turbulent moment in American history, and rather than um, believing in this sort of American liberal idea of government reform, or rather than buying into, if you want to take a critique at it, rather than buying into this idea of LULAC, of the United League of Latin American Citizens, that somehow if you get your education and you go to college and you speak English and you do all these things right, then you can build this better world. They were rejecting that type of reformist politics and really instituting their own vision of radical politics at a moment when they had to. And they won the support of the elders. It's not often when you look at some of these movements and find that the grandmothers and the grandfathers, the elders from the barrios, were behind these kids. They were kids. They were supporting them. Many of the people from the community helped to cook the breakfast. The local bodegas and stores, tienditas from the barrio, donated food. People donated clothes for the clothing drive. Medical students from Northwestern, from Columbia University, from UCLA, from Rice and other places there, Rice University in Houston, came in and contributed and volunteered to provide health screenings, for families that didn't have access to health care. They were 19, 18, 20 years old doing all of this and organizing all of these things. So it's quite a phenomenal thing when I think about it. And I didn't know we were going to get, obviously didn't know we were going to jump into this pandemic and everything that was going to happen in this last year. And I think, more than ever, sort of looking at the example of what these young radicals did, we think of radicals as irresponsible. We think of them as not wanting to negotiate at all. And yet all you see throughout these cases and throughout these stories are beautiful examples of all of that. And so I leave you with that. I think I end the book, if if you've read it, I don't think I'd spoil anything by saying that I end it with Lydia Lopez, the woman that I met in Los Angeles, who is now living in a retirement home of other progressive Christian clergy. So I remember I had lunch with her there at the retirement home, and it's a Baptist church retirement home. And I was eating lunch with her there, and she was pointing out all these radical Christian folks that had been a part of the movement. That person did that, and that person did that. There were a lot of Fuller Theological Seminary retirees that were living there. But I end with her because her story is really this narrative arc. She goes from being a Chicana activist, from being in the middle of the melee in St. Basil's on Christmas Eve in 1969, to being in the middle of the sanctuary movement in the 1980s in Los Angeles, where Father Luis Olivares was not only calling for sanctuary for refugees from Central America, but opening sanctuary for all undocumented people coming to the United States. The historian Mario Garcia says that it was Father Olivares who was the first to do that and to open up his church in that sort of way. So it's a really sort of powerful testament to the kind of continuing legacy of the Chicano movement, the kind of continuing legacy of how activists, church leaders didn't go anywhere, didn't disappear with the rise of the moral majority, that what we call the religious left, or people that were, progressives within these churches, that they got to work, that people kept doing their thing in local contexts and in local neighborhoods. And we have a lot of work, I think, as historians, as scholars, as people that are interested in knowledge and in people that are storytellers. We have a lot of work yet to do to recount these stories and to gather them and to collect them, because we're at a moment where many of these activists are in retirement homes or in their last years and so forth. And so it's our job, I think, to go and make sure that we capture their stories so we can tell them for future generations. But I'll stop there. Go and read the book now.
Thank you, Felipe. And I don't know, Iris and Felipe and Carlos, do we still have time to read? There's one more question that was put in the chat right now. We do. I see Iris nodding that we still have a little bit of time. So I like this question is bringing it even very, very present, very much to the present. And it says there are so many churches that are on the back of their heels in the current movement. What are some things that you can suggest based on your study of history to encourage them to form coalitions with Black, Brown, Indigenous, and queer and trans folks towards the changing and birthing of new worlds?
Oh man, that's a deep question. All I can say is that within every church, there are always folks that are doing amazing and creative and wonderful work. And if you're one of those people in those congregations and in those churches, I think it is imperative to not be discouraged. I think it's imperative that we continue to maintain hope. Mary, I'm trying to remember her name, but I'm reading this fantastic book, We'll Do This Until We Free Us, where she talks about hope being a discipline, that it's not naivete, that it's not some notion of not understanding the complexities of violence or of social movements or of protest, but that it is something that we ground ourselves in every single day. And I think people that are doing this work in the churches and then the kind of pushback that you sometimes get, I think it's just imperative to sort of think about that, and to really think about not just a way to sort of garner our own sort of self-care and to think about it that way, but as this author writes about, thinking about it in terms of collective care and looking out for each other. And even with people that we fundamentally disagree with, being graceful and extending grace to those folks. If there are any lessons that I gathered from these movements, is that these radicals never, never once, put it in terms of, working to disrespect or working to dishonor what they believed was the work of God within their own lives. I mean, I think I really sort of saw that extension of grace in their own lives, and I think that's significant in terms of what we try, to do in our daily lives. I'll just say this really quick to end with this, but in some of my recent writing, I did some interviews with some churches in Los Angeles that are, one church in particular, a Pentecostal church that has gotten very much involved in the Black Lives Matter movement. And they did so, I think, with a realization in the days and in the weeks after George Floyd was killed because of what they saw on television. That movement has not only spurred on a support for Black Lives Matter, but also for other movements. And the church in itself has started to engage and bring in the study of history into their Sunday school classes, where they're discussing a history book. And it's a group mostly of Salvadorans, of Latino immigrants from Central America, and looking at immigration history and studying that history, and really using the space of the church to think about how we can merge our understanding of faith and theology with our own sort of history. Because once we start to understand that, and this is what I learned mostly from this church, is that you start to understand these histories, you're in a much better position then to extend grace and to think about and understand other movements outside of your own collective understanding. So I don't know how I'm used to looking in the past, not so much in the future, or trying to do that, but I think there's certainly a lot of work, but I want to acknowledge all the good work that's also going on out there.
Well,
Yeah, there's by the way, the reference to the book that I was just citing is in the Frank just put it in there. Put it in the chat. I would highly recommend that book in terms of those of you that are doing this kind of work inside of the church, inside of academic spaces, or in your neighborhood or in your barrio.
and also, I think Frank put a link to, if you want to order Felipe's book, where you can buy his book.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I don't know, we have any. Okay. Just want to make sure. Well, first of all, Felipe, I just want to thank you for taking this time to share with us about your book. I was excited when I saw that it was published. And yeah, I got it right away and I read it. So I just encourage people to read the book. It's really interesting and just a lot of good things to think about. So thank you very much, Felipe. I also
Thank you for having me. I just want to say real quick there that I put in the discount code. This is really important. So if you go to UT Press to buy it, EXOAH, it's a 30% discount code with free shipping. So, try it out.
Yeah, so write it down now before we get off. I want to thank Caleb Gingrich. He's the MC USA logo there, but he's been our tech person behind the scene. I'm always thankful for people that do that, because thanks Caleb, because I get very confused when I have to do more than two things on Zoom. So thank you. Again, thanks to Frank for joining and helping out. I really appreciate it. And Carlos, a big thank you for the translation. That's a lot of work and you always do a great job. So thank you, Carlos. I want to remind everyone, we're going to have another webinar on April 8th. Elaine Enns and Ched Meyer's book just came out. It's called Haunting Histories, and it's a discipleship book for people that are interested in reparations. It's not what to do about reparations. It's about how you spiritually prepare yourself to even enter conversations with indigenous people about reparations. So there's a lot of, book is about a lot of internal work that you have to do to prepare for even entering those conversations. So that'll be April 8th. And I really, we started doing these books because these books are published outside of Mennonite publishing. And so, but these are Mennonite authors, and we want the church to know about them. We want the church to support them in the work that they do and the witness that they are for the church outside. So again, thank you, Felipe, and thank you, everyone. I appreciate you joining us, and hopefully we'll see you in April.